It was a warm Saturday afternoon at the city mall. Families were walking in and out of stores, kids were laughing, and people were carrying shopping bags filled with weekend purchases. The mall food court smelled of popcorn, pizza, and fresh coffee, and the entire place buzzed with the kind of ordinary energy that made people feel relaxed. Among the crowd, a woman walked calmly, holding a small shopping bag in her hand. Her name was Renee Johnson. To everyone else, she looked like any other shopper enjoying her day. She wore a simple blouse, jeans, and sneakers, and her calm expression showed no sign of stress. What most people didn't know, however, was that she wasn't there just for shopping. Renee was an FBI agent working undercover. For weeks, she had been in this neighborhood living quietly, blending in and watching closely. Her mission was delicate. She had been sent to observe and collect evidence about a local police officer who had been the subject of repeated complaints from the community. People had accused him of racial profiling, unnecessary aggression, and even physical intimidation. The FBI had been monitoring those complaints for months, and finally, they had sent Renee in to see for herself what was happening on the ground. That officer was named Daniel Miller. To most of his colleagues, he was known as tough but effective. He liked to say he kept order in the city, but residents, especially black residents, told a different story. They felt targeted, humiliated, and afraid every time Miller was on patrol. Renee had read the reports. She knew about the stories. But as an agent, she also knew that accusations weren't enough. She needed clear evidence. That was why she was there, quietly observing, blending in, waiting for Miller to reveal his true behavior when he thought no one important was watching. That afternoon, Renee stepped out of a clothing store after buying a simple scarf. She carried the small bag in her right hand and her phone in the other. She wasn't rushing, she wasn't nervous, and she wasn't drawing any attention to herself. But across the corridor, Officer Miller was on mall duty. He was walking slowly in uniform, looking around at the people coming and going. His eyes landed on Renee. For reasons only he knew, his attention sharpened. He began to follow her with his gaze. She noticed him, but she didn't react. She kept walking at the same calm pace. But Miller's suspicions seemed to grow. Perhaps he thought she looked out of place. Perhaps he simply wanted to show authority. Whatever the reason, his steps grew quicker, and within moments he was behind her. "Hey," he called out loudly. His voice echoed through the hallway, catching the attention of a few shoppers nearby. Renee stopped and turned her head. "Yes, officer," she said politely. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. His tone was sharp, filled with suspicion. Renee lifted the bag slightly. "Just a scarf. I bought it from the store right there," she explained, nodding toward the shop she had just left. But Miller didn't look convinced. His eyes narrowed. "Show me," he ordered. Renee blinked in surprise. "Excuse me?" "I said show me what's in the bag," he repeated louder this time. A few more people slowed down, watching the scene. Renee kept her calm. She opened the small bag, tilted it toward him, and revealed the folded scarf inside, still with the store's receipt. "Here it is," she said. That should have ended the matter. But instead of nodding and walking away, Miller stepped closer. His hand hovered near his holster. "ID," he barked. "Show me your ID." Renee's heart rate picked up, but her face remained steady. She had trained for moments like this. "Officer, may I ask why you're stopping me?" she asked in an even tone. "Because you're acting suspicious," he shot back. His voice carried, and now more people were turning their heads. Parents pulled their children a little closer. A couple of teenagers pulled out their phones, starting to record quietly. Renee took a slow breath. "I just walked out of a store with a purchase." "That's not suspicious," she said firmly. But Miller's jaw tightened. In one quick motion, he pulled out his gun and pointed it at her. The crowd gasped. A hush fell over the busy mall. The sound of the gun leaving its holster was sharp and terrifying. And suddenly, the ordinary Saturday scene had turned into a tense standoff. "Hands where I can see them," Miller shouted. His voice was loud, commanding, filled with a force that froze everyone around. Renee did not move quickly. She knew any sudden action could make things worse. Slowly, she lifted both hands, letting the small shopping bag dangle from her fingers. Her calmness surprised the onlookers. Some expected her to panic, to cry out, but she remained steady, her eyes fixed on Miller. In her mind, she measured every second. She knew this was no longer just about her safety. This was the evidence she had been waiting for. He had escalated a harmless situation into a dangerous one in public with dozens of witnesses. She didn't need to provoke him. He was revealing himself without her saying a word. The crowd began to murmur. Some shouted at the officer. She didn't do anything. Others begged him to lower the weapon. But Miller kept his stance, finger close to the trigger, eyes locked on her. For Renee, the moment felt like it stretched endlessly. She could feel the tension in the air, the fear of the families nearby, the shock of the teenagers recording on their phones, and the weight of Miller's decision pressing against her. Yet she did not show fear. She stood as if she had known this moment was always coming. Inside, though, her mind was clear. This was the break in her case. Miller had just shown everyone exactly what the community had been describing all along. She spoke softly, so only he could hear it first. "Officer, you need to think very carefully about what you're doing right now." His eyes flickered with something, doubt or perhaps anger. He pressed his jaw tight but did not lower his weapon. And then, with the whole mall watching, Renee prepared to do what would change the entire situation. She knew she couldn't hold her cover forever. She had walked into this mission expecting a test. Now the test had arrived sooner than expected. The crowd waited, silent, breaths held. Children clung to their parents. Phones recorded every angle. And in that heavy silence, Renee, the undercover FBI agent, stood with her hands raised, ready to reveal who she really was. The mall was silent except for the sound of Officer Miller's sharp breathing and the faint hum of air conditioning. The ordinary buzz of weekend shopping had been replaced by tension so heavy that even children stopped speaking. Dozens of eyes were fixed on the strange sight in front of them, a uniformed police officer with his gun drawn, and a calm woman standing still with her hands raised. Renee Johnson. The woman at the center of it all stayed completely composed. Her training told her that panic never helped. Every gesture, every word had to be measured. She knew that this was more than a random confrontation. It was the very behavior she had been sent to investigate. What Miller thought was just another show of control was about to become the moment that revealed his true self. Not just to her, but to everyone watching. "On your knees," Miller shouted, his voice echoing across the wide hallway of the mall. Some people in the crowd gasped. A mother clutched her child and whispered, "She didn't do anything." A man muttered, "This is insane," while raising his phone higher to capture the scene. Renee didn't move at first. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes calm but sharp. "Officer," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the air, "I have complied with your requests. You saw the contents of my bag. You have no reason to draw your weapon." Miller's face grew red, but he didn't back down. "I said on your knees." He barked again, louder this time. His hand tightened around the weapon. Renee inhaled slowly. She was weighing her options. If she kept quiet, he would push further. If she revealed her identity too soon, she might lose the chance to expose his natural behavior. But the crowd was nervous, and she knew things could spiral quickly. Finally, she decided to take control of the situation in her own way. Her voice was steady, but there was a firmness in it that made even the bystanders lean forward to listen. "You need to understand something," she said. "I am not who you think I am." Miller frowned. His finger twitched. "Don't play games with me," he snapped. Renee carefully lowered one hand toward her jacket pocket, moving slowly so everyone could see she wasn't hiding anything dangerous. "I'm going to reach into my pocket," she announced clearly for everyone to hear. "I'm going to show you my identification." The crowd held their breath. Miller's eyes followed her hand like a hawk. "Don't you dare," he warned, but Renee kept her movements slow and calm. She slipped her hand into her pocket and pulled out a small leather badge holder. With a flick, she opened it and held it high above her head. The golden FBI shield glinted under the mall's bright lights. "I'm Special Agent Renee Johnson," she declared, her voice ringing through the stunned silence. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The reaction was instant. Gasps filled the air. People who had been filming whispered in shock. "She's FBI?" One teenager muttered to his friend, his phone still recording. Parents who had been shielding their children now leaned forward to get a clearer look. The energy in the mall shifted from fear to disbelief. Miller froze. His gun wavered slightly, his confidence shaken. He hadn't expected this. In all his years of puffing up his authority, of intimidating people in public, he had never once pointed his gun at a federal agent. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Renee's eyes locked on him. You just pointed your weapon at a federal agent who was doing nothing illegal, she said firmly. You are out of line. The officer's jaw tightened. He glanced around nervously, realizing that dozens of cameras were capturing every second. People were whispering, some even saying out loud, "He's done," and "This is going viral." Still, Miller tried to regain control. I didn't know who you were," he stammered, though his tone still carried hints of arrogance. "That's the point," Renee shot back. "You don't know who anyone is. Yet you escalated a harmless situation into a dangerous one." The crowd broke into murmurs again. People nodded in agreement, muttering phrases like, "She's right," and finally someone's calling him out. Miller lowered his weapon slowly, sliding it back into the holster with trembling hands. But the damage was already done. The sight of him pointing it at her had been captured from every angle. There would be no undoing that. Renee didn't move closer to him. She didn't need to. Her calm posture, her sharp voice, and her badge were more powerful than anything he could say now. "Officer Miller," she continued, her tone even but cutting. "I've been assigned to investigate reports about your conduct. Reports about unnecessary force. Reports about targeting certain people without reason." A heavy silence fell again. Miller's face drained of color. He had always suspected someone might be watching him, but he hadn't expected it to be a woman standing right in front of him, announcing it in front of an audience. The bystanders couldn't believe what they were hearing. One man whispered, "She's been investigating him?" Another said, "No wonder she's so calm." Renee kept her eyes locked on him. "What you just did," she said, "is exactly why I'm here. And now the entire country is about to see it." At that moment, mall security arrived, rushing toward the scene after being alerted by frantic calls. They pushed through the crowd and stopped, stunned, when they saw Renee's badge. She showed it briefly, then gestured toward Miller. "I need you to step aside and secure this scene," she told them. The guards, unsure but respectful, nodded and began creating space between the crowd and the confrontation. But the damage was already done. Shoppers were whispering, recording, and sharing videos online. Within minutes, the incident was already spreading across social media. Miller, meanwhile, stood frozen. His authority, his reputation, his career, all of it had just cracked wide open. He tried to speak, but the words fell flat. "I was just doing my job," he muttered weakly. Renee didn't argue. She didn't need to. Every action, every word, every second had been captured by dozens of witnesses. Instead, she turned toward the crowd, lowering her voice slightly so only those nearby could hear. "You've seen what happened," she said softly. "The truth will come out." The people nodded, their faces a mix of respect and relief. For many of them, this moment was more than just a shocking scene in a mall. It was proof of something they had felt for years but had struggled to prove, that power unchecked could turn dangerous, and that justice sometimes needed someone brave enough to stand in its path. As the mall slowly returned to its normal hum, Renee knew this was only the beginning. The evidence she had just gathered wasn't written in files or hidden in reports. It was alive, recorded and shared by ordinary people. It was the kind of evidence no one could deny. And though the day had started with a simple purchase of a scarf, it had turned into the turning point of her entire investigation. She knew the days ahead would be complicated, filled with paperwork, testimony, and media attention. But at that moment, she allowed herself a small breath of relief, because the truth was finally out in the open. The news of what happened in the mall spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, videos of Officer Miller pointing his gun at Renee were on social media platforms, being shared by thousands of people. The clips had everything: his angry voice, the frightened crowd, her calm composure, and finally the moment she raised her badge high above her head. For the public, it was shocking and unbelievable. A local cop, caught threatening not just a citizen but a federal agent. The story had everything to stir outrage. By the next morning, it was on the local news channels. Reporters stood outside the mall, interviewing witnesses who described what they had seen. "She was so calm," one man said, shaking his head. "She never raised her voice. She didn't even move fast, and he had a gun in her face." Another woman added, "He didn't have a reason." She showed him the bag. "There was nothing suspicious, he just lost control." For Renee, the hours after the incident were filled with official calls, reports, and urgent meetings. She sat in a quiet federal office late at night, typing up a detailed statement for her supervisors. Every word had to be exact. She explained step by step what had happened, how Miller had followed her, demanded her bag, escalated without cause, and then drawn his weapon. She didn't need to exaggerate. The facts spoke for themselves. Still, she knew this was only the beginning. One incident was powerful, but the investigation was bigger than just what happened at the mall. The FBI had collected months of complaints against Miller, and her undercover assignment was meant to confirm the pattern. What happened in public had been dramatic, but the real work, building a case that could withstand scrutiny, was just starting. The following week, Renee sat in a conference room with 2 senior agents and a federal prosecutor. Files were spread across the table. One of the agents, a man named Richard Hayes, leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, Johnson, you couldn't have asked for clearer evidence. He gave it to you on a silver platter." Renee folded her hands. "It's strong, yes. But I don't want to rely only on that one moment. If we bring this forward, he'll claim he made a mistake, that he didn't know who I was. He'll say he was just doing his job." The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda Torres, nodded slowly. "You're right. We need to show that what happened in the mall was not an isolated mistake. We need to connect it to a pattern of misconduct." That was exactly what Renee had been preparing for. She pulled out her notebook, filled with weeks of observations. She had recorded times when Miller stopped black men for no reason, searched bags without cause, and even shouted at teenagers who had done nothing but walk home. None of those moments were as dramatic as the mall scene, but together, they painted a clear picture. As the team discussed strategies, Miller himself was living a very different reality. At the police station, he walked in to find his colleagues whispering. Some nodded politely, but others avoided eye contact. The video had embarrassed the entire department. His supervisor, Captain Rogers, called him into his office almost immediately. "Miller," the captain said sternly, "what in the world were you thinking?" "She looked suspicious," Miller muttered. "I was doing my job." "Your job?" Rogers snapped. "Your job isn't to pull your weapon on innocent shoppers, let alone a federal agent. Do you realize what kind of storm you've created for this department?" Miller clenched his fists but didn't answer. He had built his reputation on being the tough cop, the one who didn't back down. But now, instead of being respected, he was under suspicion himself. Back in her apartment, Renee reflected quietly on what had happened. She knew she had exposed him, but she also thought about the crowd at the mall, the way people had gasped, the way parents had pulled their children closer, the way teenagers had instinctively pulled out their phones. It said everything about the fear and mistrust that already existed. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about the system that had allowed him to act like this for so long. One evening, she received an email from her supervisor with an attachment. It was a collection of community testimonies. People had begun coming forward after seeing the viral video. They felt encouraged, finally believing that someone was listening. The emails described encounters with Miller in heartbreaking detail. A young man wrote about being stopped 3 times in 1 week while walking home from his job at a grocery store. A mother described how her teenage son cried after being shouted at for looking suspicious in front of their own house. Renee read each testimony carefully. With every line, she felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. This was more than an assignment now. It was about justice for real people whose lives had been shaped by fear. At the same time, Miller grew more desperate. He watched the news reports in anger, seeing his name dragged through the mud. He told himself it wasn't fair, that people didn't understand the dangers of policing, that he was being targeted. But deep down, even he couldn't deny the truth. His temper had gotten the best of him, and now it was too late to undo the damage. The real turning point came when the FBI called a meeting with the city officials. Renee attended with her team, presenting the evidence they had collected. The mall incident was the centerpiece, but it was supported by dozens of reports, witness statements, and community complaints. One by one, the officials saw the pattern. It wasn't a single mistake. It was a repeated abuse of power. During the meeting, one city council member leaned forward and said, "Agent Johnson, when you stood in that mall, weren't you afraid?" "He had a gun pointed at you." Renee paused. The memory was sharp in her mind. The weight of the silence, the frightened eyes of children, the cold metal of his gun aimed at her. But she answered simply, "Yes, but fear doesn't excuse silence. If no one stands up in moments like that, the behavior continues." The room fell quiet. Her words carried weight not just as an FBI agent, but as a person who had lived through the danger firsthand. That night, as Renee walked home, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. She had gone from blending quietly into the crowd to standing in front of cameras, city officials, and community members. The case was no longer hidden. It was unfolding publicly, and there was no going back. For Miller, each day became heavier. Suspension loomed, and the thought of criminal charges hung in the air. The man who once walked confidently through the city now avoided crowded places, fearing whispers and stares. The mall confrontation had not only shaken his career, but stripped away the image he had built for himself. For Renee, the struggle was different. She felt the weight of being in the public eye, of carrying the voices of those who had been silent for too long. But she also felt something else, resolve. She knew part 3 of her story wasn't about fear or danger anymore. It was about responsibility. The turning point had come, and the days ahead would determine whether justice truly followed. The day of the city hearing arrived. It was held in the large town hall, a building with tall glass windows and a wide entrance where reporters had already gathered. Cameras flashed, microphones were lined up, and the community had come in numbers. Some people carried signs calling for justice. Others simply wanted to see what would happen next. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with curiosity, anger, and hope all at once. Inside, the council chamber was packed. The city council members sat at the front, their nameplates shining under the lights. Local officials filled one side of the room, and citizens crowded into every seat. At the center of it all sat Special Agent Renee Johnson, calm as always, her posture upright, her badge pinned discreetly but visible on her jacket. To one side, Officer Daniel Miller sat with his lawyer. His face looked tired. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his shoulders no longer carried the same confidence they once did. He was no longer the man striding through the mall with authority. Now he was a man under the sharp gaze of a city demanding answers. The council chair, a serious man with gray hair named Robert Franklin, tapped the microphone. "We are here to discuss the incident that took place at the city mall," he began. "We are also here to review the wider concerns that have been raised about Officer Daniel Miller's conduct." A hush filled the room. Franklin continued, "We will begin by hearing from Special Agent Johnson." Renee stood. Every eye in the room followed her as she walked to the podium. She adjusted the microphone, looked out at the audience, and began speaking in her calm, clear voice. "On that Saturday afternoon, I was not in disguise. I was simply walking out of a store carrying a purchase. I was stopped without cause. I complied with every order given to me, even showing the contents of my bag. And yet Officer Miller escalated the situation, drawing his weapon and aiming it at me in a public space filled with families, children, and ordinary citizens." Gasps and murmurs rose from the crowd. People shook their heads in disbelief, though many had already seen the video online. Hearing it in her voice gave it more weight. Renee continued, "At that moment, I revealed my identity. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What I witnessed that day was not a simple mistake. It was the reflection of a pattern of behavior that has been reported many times by the people in this community." She paused, letting her words sink in. The council members leaned forward, listening intently. "I have spent weeks observing Officer Miller's conduct," she said. "I have documented stops without cause, intimidation of young people, and unnecessary force. What happened in that mall was not unusual. It was simply public. It showed everyone what many had been experiencing in silence." The room fell into a heavy quiet. Renee lowered her papers and looked directly at the council. "I stand here not just for myself, but for the voices of this community who have carried this weight for too long." There was a moment of stillness, and then the room erupted in quiet applause, quickly hushed by the chair. Next, it was Miller's turn. He rose slowly, his lawyer guiding him to the podium. His hands gripped the sides tightly as he leaned forward. His voice trembled slightly, but he tried to sound firm. "I didn't know she was an agent," he began. "I was just doing my job, keeping order. When someone looks suspicious, it's my duty to act. I didn't mean to escalate things. I made a mistake, but it wasn't malicious." But his words fell flat. People in the crowd shook their heads. A man whispered, "That's what they always say." Miller's lawyer quickly added, "Officer Miller has served this city for years. He has put himself in danger countless times to protect others. We cannot let one misunderstanding erase his service. But Renee's words still lingered in the air, and then came the testimonies. One by one, community members stepped forward. A mother with tired eyes described how her teenage son was stopped 3 times in 1 month by Miller while walking home from basketball practice. Her voice cracked as she said, "My son asked me if he was guilty of something just for being himself." Do you know what that does to a child? A young man stood next, his voice shaking. I was pushed against a wall by him for no reason. He said I looked suspicious. I was carrying textbooks from the library. Every testimony added weight. Each story fit into the larger picture that Renee had described. By the time the last person spoke, the room felt heavy with truth. Miller sat quietly, his head lowered. His lawyer whispered in his ear. But it was clear that the tide had turned. The community's voices, paired with Renee's calm but powerful testimony, had created an undeniable case. Then something unexpected happened. One of the city council members turned to Miller directly and asked, "Officer Miller, do you believe what you did in that mall was the right thing?" For a long moment, Miller didn't answer. His lips parted, but no words came out. Finally, in a low voice, he muttered, "No." The room went silent again. That one word carried more power than any speech he could have made. The council chair leaned forward. "Thank you. That will be noted." By the end of the hearing, it was clear what direction things would go. The council would recommend suspension and further investigation. The FBI would continue its work, and the prosecutor would begin reviewing charges. The decision wasn't final yet, but the momentum was undeniable. As the hearing closed, people stood and began clapping, not for Miller, but for Renee and for the community members who had spoken. For the first time, they felt that someone had stood with them, someone who could not be ignored. Outside, reporters crowded around Renee. Cameras flashed as microphones were pushed toward her. "Agent Johnson, how did you stay so calm when a gun was pointed at you?" one reporter shouted. Renee gave a small, steady smile. "I stayed calm because I knew the truth would come out. Fear only has power when we let it silence us." Her words appeared on the evening news, repeated across networks. They struck a chord with people far beyond the city. That night, Miller sat alone in his home, staring at the dark ceiling. He thought about the mall, the hearing, the looks of disappointment in his captain's eyes, the stories people told. He had always convinced himself that he was just doing his job, that being tough was necessary. But now he realized what others had seen all along. His toughness had turned into intimidation, his authority into abuse. And now, there was no hiding it. Meanwhile, Renee returned to her apartment, exhausted but filled with a quiet sense of resolve. The climax of the case had arrived. The truth was no longer hidden in reports or whispered in back rooms. It had been spoken aloud in front of cameras, in front of leaders, and most importantly, in front of the people who had lived it. She looked out her window at the city lights. She knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt the momentum of justice moving in the right direction. The weeks after the hearing changed everything in the city. What had started as one shocking incident in a mall had now turned into a national conversation. News channels across the country played the footage of Officer Miller pointing his gun at Renee, the calm FBI agent standing tall, and the dramatic reveal of her badge. Commentators debated the case on television. Social media platforms were filled with people sharing their thoughts. Some praised Renee's bravery. Others spoke about how the video reminded them of their own experiences. For the community, there was a new feeling in the air: hope. People who had once believed that no one would ever listen to their voices now felt they had been heard. The testimonies shared during the hearing were not forgotten. Parents spoke more openly, young people felt less alone, and conversations about fairness and accountability began to grow louder. Meanwhile, Officer Miller's life took a very different turn. He was placed on official suspension while the investigation continued. His badge and weapon were taken from him. For the first time in years, he was not on patrol, not wearing a uniform, not walking with authority. Instead, he was at home, facing the silence that came after years of ignoring the voices of the people he had once sworn to protect. The FBI continued to build its case. Renee worked long hours reviewing the footage, sorting through testimonies, and preparing reports. She wasn't interested in revenge. Her goal was justice, not just for herself, but for the community that had carried these burdens silently for so long. She reminded herself daily, this was not about one moment in a mall, but about a pattern that had to be broken. One morning, Renee sat across from federal prosecutor Linda Torres in a quiet office. Files covered the desk. Torres flipped through the pages and finally looked up. "This is strong," she said. "The mall video is powerful, but paired with all this evidence, it's undeniable. He didn't just make a mistake. He created fear again and again, and now he will have to answer for it." Renee nodded slowly. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Court cases took time and defenses were always strong. But she also knew that the truth had already been seen. Even if Miller's lawyer tried to argue otherwise, the people had already witnessed what had happened with their own eyes. The trial drew near. Once again, the town was filled with reporters and citizens. The courtroom was packed. Renee sat on the witness stand answering questions calmly, just as she had during the hearing. She described the moment in the mall, the way Miller escalated, the fear in the crowd and her decision to reveal her badge. Every word was measured, but it carried weight because it came from someone who had lived it. Community members also testified again, repeating their stories under oath. One after another, they painted a picture that was impossible to deny. Miller's lawyer tried to argue, tried to suggest that his actions came from stress or fear, but the pattern was too clear. Finally, the jury gave its verdict: guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority. Miller would face consequences both legally and professionally. His career as a police officer was over. The news spread quickly. For some, it felt like justice had finally been served. For others, it was just the beginning of a larger conversation about accountability and change. But one thing was certain: the city would never forget the sight of that mall confrontation, and it would never forget the courage of the woman who stood calm when a gun was pointed at her. When the trial was over, Renee walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight. Reporters surrounded her again, but this time she paused to speak. "This case was never about one person," she said softly. "It was about a community. It was about people who deserve to walk home, shop in a mall, or simply live without fear. I was given a chance to stand, but I want to make it clear. The strength came from the people who spoke out, who trusted their voices would matter. This outcome belongs to them." Her words echoed across the news that evening, and for many watching, it was more than just a story about an officer and an agent. It was a reminder that silence can be broken, that truth can rise, and that justice, though slow, can be achieved. Back at home that night, Renee finally allowed herself to rest. She sat by her window, looking out at the quiet city lights. She thought about the faces she had seen at the hearings, the trembling voices of teenagers, the tears of mothers, the quiet nods of fathers. She thought about the fear in the mall that day, and how it had transformed into something powerful, evidence that could not be ignored. She also thought about Miller. She did not feel triumph over him. Instead, she felt a kind of sadness. Somewhere along the line, he had lost the meaning of his duty. Authority had become something he used for himself, instead of for the people he was meant to serve. His downfall was not something to celebrate, but a lesson to remember. As she sat there, Renee reflected on her own role. Being an agent was not about glory, and it was not about standing in the spotlight. It was about carrying responsibility, even when it was heavy, even when it was dangerous. That day in the mall, she had stood still not just for herself, but for everyone who had been forced to remain quiet. And in the end, that choice had changed everything. Weeks later, the city began small but important reforms. Training programs were updated. A community board was formed to review complaints more carefully. Officers were reminded again and again of the duty they carried to serve fairly. The changes were not perfect, and they would not erase the past, but they were a step in the right direction. And that was enough for now. The mall itself also changed. Where fear had once filled the air, people now walked with a little more confidence. Some would pause near the very spot where the confrontation happened, whispering about it. Parents told their children about the day the FBI agent stood strong. Teenagers laughed softly, remembering how they had been the first to capture the video that shook the city. Renee remained humble. She didn't seek attention, and she never claimed the spotlight. When people thanked her, she simply said, I was doing my job. But those who had been there, those who had seen the truth unfold, knew it was more than a job. It was courage. In the end, the story became more than headlines. It became a reminder of two important truths. First, that authority without accountability was dangerous. And second, that one person standing calmly with courage could make a difference not just in one moment, but for an entire community. As Renee closed her eyes that night, she felt peace. The city was still healing, but it was on the path toward something better. And she knew deep down that the silence of fear had been broken forever.